Hello and welcome to today's meeting of Democrats of Greater Tucson. My name is Larry Bodine and I'm the president, and I'll be your host today. And we have a special guest, Representative Daniel Hernandez. Daniel, give us a wave. He is logging in all the way from New Mexico today, so we're really glad to have you here. We have a couple of quick announcements. Why don't we begin with you, Kathy? Tell us about membership and why people should join.
Okay, good stuff. Well, hey, everybody, glad you could join us. We want everybody who's still out there enjoying the benefit of viewing our DGT meeting online who hasn't yet paid your dues. Remember, it's only $20. You'll be there as a member and you'll love it. It's great to be where the action is, and that's where we are. No better place to spend your $20. Go into the dgt.org and it shows you how to do it right there. Thanks a lot, and right back to you, Larry.
So, Kathy, I have a quick question for you. Is our speaker, Daniel Hernandez, a member of VGT?
No, he's not yet, but I know he will soon be, right?
I've been in the past, but I need to renew. This is a good reminder.
Right.
Let's go over to Christina Early. Tell us about our upcoming meetings and the upcoming fun event you've got planned.
Great. Hi, everybody. Glad you're here. Next up is the Drinking Democratically. I put a link in the chat. That is where you can go to register for our Drinking Democratically, and we're going to return to Augustine's Kitchen, which is in the Mercado downtown, just west of I-10 off of Congress. We had our first two events with them earlier in the summer. I contacted them and they said, sure, come on back. Once again, they provide us a room with no room fee, but we do have to get our own drinks and order from the bar, which is no big deal. And if you want to have dinner later, do recommend that you get reservations for that. When you register through that link and through Eventbrite, all of that information, phone numbers, and so forth are in that website. So check that out. I hope everybody will come. We had a great time at Brother John's last week. 20 of us gathered. We talked all kinds of subjects. So please join us. It'll be a little celebration. Hopefully we will have gotten all the petitions signed that we needed to. So thanks everybody for being here today, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks.
And thank you, Christina, for all your hard work organizing all of these events. You know, I could say everybody appreciates it. Let's see, Lucy Messing, one of our stalwart members, has her hand up. Lucy, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, everyone. Happy Monday. Here we are on another busy week of collecting signatures. I have a couple announcements. One, the Education Council is meeting this Thursday, 4:30 on Zoom. Anyone interested in joining us can email me and I'll send you the link. Usually our meetings are from 4:30 to 5:30. Sometimes they go a little over. And there's always something to talk about related to public education. The other thing is from the Tanque Verde Dems. On September 11th, we are having the 3 Democratic candidates for City Council, Kevin Dahl, Richard Fimbres, and Steve Kasachik. In addition, we'll have speakers for the Tucson Fight for 15. And that's the 11th from 10 to 11. So hope to see you at one of the events. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Let me introduce our speaker today, and that would be, of course, State Representative Daniel Hernandez. He is running for Congress to fight for progressive values. Daniel is a Democrat from Legislative District 2, covering South Tucson, Green Valley, Sahuarita, and the Tohono O'odham Nation. Since 2017, he has served in the Arizona House. He was one of the youngest people ever elected. He's currently age 31, and he's a co-founder of the House LGBTQ Caucus. Daniel has worked across the aisle to pass bills protecting survivors of sexual assault and securing $20 million for schools, school counselors, school and social workers. And he also led the fight against legislation that would discriminate against LGBTQ Arizonans. He was born in Tucson. He's a first-generation college student, and he attended the U of A, where he interned for Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. He was there on the day of the tragic attack on her life, which resulted in 6 deaths and 13 people injured. Daniel was the first to administer first aid to the Congresswoman before the EMTs arrived, and he was named a national hero by President Obama. And with that, Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Larry. It's good to be back with DGT. It's been a couple of years since I've been able to see everyone in person. I was just telling Larry before we got started that it's so weird to keep doing DGT meetings over Zoom, but I'm excited that we're able to chat. It's good to see so many familiar faces and a couple of new ones. So as was mentioned by Larry, my name is Daniel Hernandez. I'm a state representative representing District Number 2, which includes all of Santa Cruz County, Green Valley, Sahuarita, and the southeast part of Tucson, including Davis Mountain Air Force Base. So before I talk to you a little bit more about why I'm running for Congress, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about who I am and kind of my background. So I grew up here in Tucson. I'm the son of an immigrant from Mexico named Consuelo and a construction worker from California named Daniel. I was born in 1990, and when I was about 5 years old, I was on the edge of my bed with my sisters Alma and Consuelo. Alma, who's a state representative from District Number 3, and my sister Consuelo, who's a member of the Sunnyside Unified School District Governing Board. And we were jumping up and down as little kids do on beds. And during one of those jumps, Alma thought it'd be funny to kick me. And when she kicked me, I fell backwards and hit the back of my skull on a little metal filing cabinet that was right next to the bed. And I think it's, one of those things where we don't need to talk about how unsafe it is to have sharp metal corners around little kids. But I ended up hitting the back of my head and started bleeding. And my sister started screaming, and my mom comes in and says, "We're going to have to go to the hospital." And I don't know if you remember being 5 years old, but for me, at least, being 5 years old, I'd only ever been to the hospital when a family member was sick or dying. So when my mom comes in and says, "We're going to the hospital," this went from an already scary thing because I was bleeding and my head hurt to now I'm dying. So we put a towel around my head. My mom didn't drive at the time, so she actually called a taxi that then took us to the hospital, but she called the hospital ahead and let them know that we were coming in. And the way that she described it must have made it seem like my head was about to be detached, because by the time we got to the hospital, there was a nurse who was waiting out in front. And she takes one look at me and she says, "We're going to make you feel better. Everything's going to be okay." And she takes me into her arm and checks the back of my head. And when we go inside, they clean me up, and a physician says, "If you're really brave, you'll get a reward." And he took a look at it. He gave me 5 stitches, he gave me $5, one for every stitch that I got. And while we were waiting for the results from the different scans, he said, "We're going to do something. Do you know what doctors and nurses do here at a hospital?" And I said, "Well, people come to die." He said, "No, what we do here is try and help make sure that people can get better so they can go back to their families." So he said, "Let me show you something." And he goes over to another patient and he says, "This is my assistant, Daniel. Is it okay if he listens to your heartbeat?" And he let me use his stethoscope to listen to the person's heartbeat. And it was from that moment on that I really decided that I want to help people, that I wanted to make my community a better place. But growing up on the south side of Tucson, there wasn't really many examples of people who helped their community other than nurses and doctors. So from the age of 5 to about 17, I decided I wanted to be a doctor. So I did everything I could to try and get better prepared for that. By the time I was 10, I'd played my med school interview about 1,000,000 times in my head. So I trained as a nursing assistant. I trained as a phlebotomist in the wonderful career and technical education programs that we had at our public schools in Sunnyside. And I also did 2 years of cancer research at the University of Arizona Cancer Center. So by the time I was 17, I had a weird realization, which was we'd never had a woman president. I had a history teacher who said, women couldn't be president when I asked him why there were no women on the wall. And he said it was because women were too emotional. And I thought that was a weird thing for a teacher to be saying in a classroom that had both boys and girls. So I said, well, I want to help elect the first woman president. And it was right around that time that then Senator Clinton announced that she was running for president back in 2007. And I did something that completely changed the direction of my life, which was go on her website and sign up to volunteer, never expecting anything to come from it. But a couple weeks later, I got a phone call from someone who said, "I'm a volunteer for the Hillary campaign, and we'd like to invite you to come and help us do some canvassing." I'd never heard of canvassing before. My family was very apolitical. My dad hadn't voted in almost 20 years until I made him register in 2008 and made him vote by turning in his early ballot in the mail. My mom was actually not a US citizen until 2016. So she wasn't eligible to vote at that time. So I started knocking on doors, learning how to talk to voters, and I really enjoyed it. And then June of 2008 came and Hillary withdrew from the race and said she was conceding to President Obama. And I said, I'm never working on another campaign ever again. I hate this. Losing your first campaign that you ever work on is a really tough thing. I thought I had not made enough calls into Iowa and New Hampshire, and it was all my fault. This one Latino 17-year-old not making enough calls into New Hampshire and Iowa had single-handedly brought down Hillary's presidential campaign. And I said, I'm never working on campaigns ever again. And then 2 or 3 days later, I got a phone call inviting me to an event that was being held by Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. And they said, we just want you to come and attend. Just come and listen. And up until this point, Hillary's campaign was a really weird thing because we never saw the candidate. Where when we got invited to listen to Gabby in person, not only could we see Gabby, we could talk to her. And she was always fond of saying, I don't do handshakes, I do hugs. So by the time that event ended, I went from I'm never working on a campaign ever again to signing up as an intern on her congressional campaign and working that entire year to help make sure that she got reelected. And it was my first taste of working with a candidate and getting to see them one-on-one. When I spent a lot of time with her and I started spending more time with her and her staff. I got to meet her father, Spencer, who's since passed. I got to meet now Senator Kelly at that time as well, because I was always around. It was the kind of intern that they called when they needed something. And I would show up and say, can I bring pan dulce? Can I bring some donuts? Can I bring some coffee? So I really enjoyed doing that internship. And I thought, this is going to be the last thing I ever do. But towards the end of that time, Gabby asked me something that nobody had ever bothered to ask me before, which is, well, why do you want to be a doctor? And I never had someone push back and ask me why. Everyone always just said, great, you want to be a doctor, and then kind of give you a pat on the back and wish you good luck. But you wanted to find out the reason why. And I told her, well, it's because I want to help people. She said, well, have you ever thought about the idea of being an advocate? And I said, no, what does that mean? She talked to me about this idea that you could be somebody who could be a voice for others who couldn't speak up for themselves, particularly in places where policies and laws were being made. And I didn't understand that concept because being from a very loud Mexican-American family, the idea of people not being able to speak up for themselves was a foreign concept, because in my family, if you weren't the loudest, you didn't get heard. But when she explained this idea of advocacy, of being able to speak not just for yourself, but being able to advocate for other people, it really got me interested in doing more. So I started working as an intern for a group called the Arizona Students Association, and I started going to the state capitol at the age of 18, lobbying for affordable and accessible higher education for all Arizonans. By the time I was 20, I passed my first piece of legislation that was signed into law by the governor. And then I just kind of got the political bug and I stayed in it. Obviously, as many of you know, I was with Congresswoman Gabby Giffords in 2011 when I was interning for her congressional office when the shooting happened. That was another really tragic and monumental event in my life, because it really solidified in me the desire to keep being involved in public service and not letting fear of anything, particularly of gun violence, be something that pushed me out of this realm. But instead of being the person that was always behind the scenes, as I always thought I would be, I decided to make my first run for office. And in 2011, I ran and got elected to the Sunnyside Unified School District Governing Board. It was a tough election because I'd never run for office before. And I honestly thought that there was someone who was better qualified, who was just waiting. And I sat around and waited until the last day to file my signatures to run, when the only other option for the school district was a woman who was running to fire a principal that had fired her as a school district employee. And I said, if that's the best that we have, then maybe me running is important to be able to make sure that we have a voice who's going to advocate for the staff, the students, and also the entire Sunnyside community. I spent the first year and a half on the Sunnyside board trying to get to learn how to be able to get things done. It was a really formative and interesting experience. As some of you might recall that were in Tucson at the time, we had a very controversial superintendent, and we actually had an attempt to recall me for asking too many questions and for asking for accountability. When they tried to recall me, and the signatures that they needed were about 1,300, they got about 80. So I then looked at the numbers and said, if all it takes is 1,300 signatures to take someone to a recall election, maybe I should do this. So I worked with a small community group to make sure that we were advocating to try and get more people who were really fired up about the bad things that were going on in Sunnyside involved. We gave them an option. We said, we can remove these board members who are doing things that are not helping out our community. So at about 6 months later, we had an election where we recalled 2 of my fellow board members. So I went from being in a 2-3 minority on the school board to a 4-1 majority and got elected as the youngest school board president in Sunnyside history. When I became president, I said, I will do this for the remainder of this term, and I will work on a couple of things: opening a K-8 fine arts magnet school, which we did at Gallego Elementary, doing a compensation study to find out where our employees are in terms of their peers, so we can make sure that we bring those who are making the least to at least the median level for the people in Pima County, and also passing comprehensive sex education, or at least as comprehensive as Arizona state law will allow, because we have some pretty backwards laws when it comes to comprehensive sex education. Also, creating a strategic plan for the first time in 10 years to make sure that we knew what direction the district needed to move in, to make sure that we restored trust in our community and also in our staff. And then finally, and I think most importantly, hiring a new superintendent. And then in 2016, I decided to run for a state legislative seat against a Republican named Chris Ackerley. In order to get to a Democratic majority, we would need to make sure that we stopped losing a seat in Pima County. And we kept doing this fun whack-a-mole game where we'd pick up one seat in the legislature and then lose one in a neighboring district. And I said, we need to stop doing that. So I ran in 2016 for the state house. At the same time, I was running the National Latino Outreach Program at Planned Parenthood while I was running. And then because of my experience and my background in elections, Planned Parenthood actually made me the director of the coordinated campaign, helping in Nevada and in Colorado to make sure that we work together with the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Cortez Masto campaign to elect the first Latina senator in Nevada, and also electing Hillary Clinton president in Nevada and Colorado. I'm proud to say I won my election, and we also won my states. Unfortunately, we didn't get the results we wanted in 2016. But when I got to the legislature, I had already been going for the previous 6 years. For the time that I got to the state house, I'd already had a lot of experience lobbying and meeting with lawmakers. So I came in with a lot of relationships. And the first bill that I introduced was actually one that came to me from constituents. It was one that would exempt feminine hygiene products, diapers, and baby formula from sales taxes, because one of the things that I've learned as someone who has been talking to constituents now for 5.5 years as a legislator is the high cost of things like diapers make it harder for women and families to be able to go back to work when they are ready to go back to work, because it is something that a lot of us take for granted. But feminine hygiene products and diapers are not luxury items or necessities to be able to live your life. So making sure that we worked on that. I've introduced that bill 5 years. I've actually passed it out of committees, but have not been able to see it all the way through. So I'm hoping this will be the year where we finally get that done to make sure that we have equity for women and for young families, and also for people who are disabled or seniors who have incontinence products, because we included those as well. As a member of the State House, when I got to the legislature, I realized that we had a large presence of LGBTQ lawmakers, but we had no formal way of actually doing anything as a community. So I went to the other 4 members of the House and the Senate that were openly gay, and I said, let's start a caucus. Let's start and create an opportunity for us to be able to bring stakeholders together to talk about issues impacting the LGBTQ community. And they said, that's a great idea, and then made me the chair of the caucus. So I was one of the co-founders and the first ever chair of the LGBTQ caucus. Against my will, was made the chair and served for the last 3 years. This year, I stepped down when I announced that I was running for Congress. And I think a lot of times when I'm working on some of these issues, particularly issues impacting the LGBTQ community, I would always get a lot of folks who say, wow, you guys are really in for a tough fight. And we have been. As the chair of the LGBTQ caucus, I actually led the efforts to defeat the trans athlete bill and was the first state in the country to defeat a bill that tried to demonize trans children from being able to participate in our sports. We were also able to do something really big in 2019 when I worked with my Republican colleagues to repeal a law that was known as No Promo Homo. It was put into place in 1991 during the height of the AIDS crisis, and it said that you are not allowed to talk about LGBTQ people or to promote them. And even though it had to do with sex education, the way that the law was written in 1991 was so broad that most school districts in Arizona chose not to even talk about LGBTQ folks in our history classes or in our art classes because they were worried that their funding would get cut. So in 2019, I worked with my Republican colleagues to be able to repeal that. And by a vote of 55-5 in the House and 21-9 in the Senate, we were able to repeal the law that had made it illegal for you to talk about the LGBTQ community in Arizona public schools. I also led the fight against some of the really onerous abortion restrictions, some of which have been passed and signed into law and are currently held up in the courts. But working as someone who has been an advocate for reproductive freedom and reproductive rights for the last 5 years, and even before that as a school board member, we've been able to make sure that we killed multiple bills and also supported good legislation like the repeal of no promo homo. But after the last 5 years in the legislature, I've been through it all. I've been through a really tough training ground, and I am running for Congress because I know that Southern Arizona needs a strong voice in the vein of Gabby Giffords, Ron Barber, and Ann Kirkpatrick, somebody who's going to be able to work across the aisle to actually get results delivered for Southern Arizona. The entire time that I've been in the legislature, I've been focused on building coalitions and being able to get wins, even on some issues that normally Democrats don't have a lot of success in, because I'm going into these conversations, going to these rooms and fighting hard because I'm tenacious and because I'm someone who is passionate and dedicated to making sure we do whatever it takes to make sure that we're protecting the most vulnerable in our community, that we're fighting to ensure that we have equity and equality for all Arizonans. So I'm really excited about this race. I'm going to share one more quick thing, Larry, if that's okay, and then we'll open it up for questions. Does that sound okay?
All right, go right ahead.
Yeah. I'm running for this congressional seat. The district is about 27% Latino and has never had a Latino member of Congress. I've been someone who's been working in this community, not just since I've been a candidate, but have been working in this community back to my days when I would go down to Douglas on behalf of Gabby's campaign to go talk to Spanish-speaking voters and register them to vote. So this is a community that I've had deep ties to for a long time. I'm proud to have the support of people like Pat Fleming, the last Democrat elected to the legislature from Cochise County. I just got endorsed by Equality PAC and by the Victory Fund, looking to make sure that we elect more LGBTQ people to Congress and to the different offices around the country. And I'm also proud to be the only candidate that has any labor support at this point in the race. I've gotten endorsed by LAUNA, which is the laborers and construction workers, by the Boilermakers, and by the Arizona Federation of Teachers. And most recently, I was endorsed by 4 members of Congress, including Congresswoman Norma Torres out of California, Congressman Richie Torres out of New York, and Congressman David Cicilline and Mark Takano, who are co-chairs of the Equality PAC caucus. So I'm really excited. We've had a really interesting couple of weeks. We just ended the legislative session. That was one of the worst legislative sessions that I've ever been a part of. But we were able to still get a couple of good things done, including some investments into broadband infrastructure and really looking at making sure that we expanded telemedicine for some of these communities where there are very few options for providers. Healthcare has been one of my top priorities since I've been in the legislature and even before. So I was really excited to see that we were doing more to expand access. So I'm happy to answer questions, but again, thank you so much to DGT for welcoming me. It's kind of like being with friends and family because there's so many familiar faces. So I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have, but thank you so much. And like I mentioned, I'm just really excited to be able to run, to be able to have a strong voice for Southern Arizona in Congress.
And to get things rolling, Daniel, let me ask you, what should the national government be doing right now about gun safety? There hasn't been a gun safety bill passed in decades and decades, and I think you, of all people, has the background to make a difference here.
Yeah, thanks, Larry, for that question. You know, gun violence is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, not just because of the shooting in Tucson, but because I used to be the state director for Everytown for Gun Safety. So before Moms Demand Action was even in existence, I was working connecting gun violence survivors and other advocates, both at the state capitol and around the country, to make sure that we were fighting for better gun laws. There's a couple of different things that I think we need to be looking at right now when it comes to firearms. So first, we need to acknowledge that we need to get something done on background checks. It's been 13 years. It's been 10 years since I started working on gun issues, since the shooting in Tucson, but it's been a very, very long time since we've had any meaningful gun laws. Requiring background checks on all gun sales is something that we have agreement, not just from Democrats, not just from Republicans, from independents and everyone in between. Background checks help save lives because what they do is they make sure that we limit the ability for those who have been criminally indicted and have been charged, or also from folks who are dangerously mentally ill from being able to have access to firearms. There's a new growing thing that I think we all should be very concerned about, and that's ghost guns. Ghost guns are things that you can order kits that you can develop and create at home and function just as any other firearm. So there's 3D printing, but there's also kits that you can buy that do not have serial numbers. And they're really dangerous because they're referred to as ghost guns because there's no way to keep track of them. When we have guns that are bought through background checks at federally licensed gun dealers, we know the serial number of the gun, we know who's owned it, and we know what the chain of custody is. But with these ghost guns, we're really concerned that people are now buying these kits and creating their own guns at home that can be used for violent crimes or for murder, and we wouldn't know where these guns are coming from. So we need to make sure that we do something on ghost guns. I've actually been partnering with multiple gun violence prevention organizations, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms is actually right now helping draft rules and is taking public comments. So if you haven't already, you can go to the ATF website and urge them to create rules so that we can regulate the ghost gun industry to make sure that we're not letting folks buy untraceable guns that we don't know where they're being used, where they're being bought, or how they're being developed.
We have a question from Andrea Kennedy. Andrea, go right ahead.
Hey, Andrea.
Hello, Daniel. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
As I was listening to you earlier, I remembered all the times I said, I'm never working on anyone's campaign again when they lost until I volunteered for the next one.
Right.
So your story of your journey to politics is very inspiring and illuminating. And I was thinking today about solar. Is there money in there, especially for people that really can't afford it? Women like myself who are alone and
Right.
we want to stay in our house, but we don't have a lot of money. And
Right.
I was wondering if you had any information on, could there be some money coming to Tucson for that? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Andrea. I think it brings up a couple of really important things that we need to talk about. One is there are two infrastructure agreements that are kind of making their way through Congress right now. There's the bipartisan infrastructure, which is more of the hard infrastructure, money for broadband, money for roads, money for bridges. And that was a deal that was negotiated with a bipartisan group of U.S. senators that was led in part by our Senator Kyrsten Sinema. But we also have what is kind of referred to as the human infrastructure deal, which is something that has to do with not only hard infrastructure, but it has to do with people. We have things like the Paid Family Leave Act, which has been incorporated in negotiations or in conversations in that. We also have a couple of things like a climate corps that would work to train people to take on jobs that would help make sure that we're taking action to reduce climate change. And I know Congressman Grijalva has been a big advocate of that climate change corps. I'm not sure what the final numbers are going to look like. I think right now we're a little worried that the final number that was being spoken about, which was about $3 trillion, will have to be cut down because of unease by certain senators that the package is too big. So the reconciliation package is one where they need 51 senators, which would mean all Democrats and then Vice President Harris voting with the Democrats, so they wouldn't need any Republicans. The other deal is a bipartisan one, which is smaller but has to do with the hard infrastructure. So I think there is going to be some conversation about getting money for different things related to climate change. We don't know what the final deal is going to look like because they're actually going to have to go to committee. So my recommendation is actually to reach out to our current sitting members of Congress from Southern Arizona, particularly Congressman Grijalva, and let him know that this is a priority for you. And also to Congresswoman Kirkpatrick, because she sits on the Appropriations Committee. They're going to be going through the committee process to say, okay, we have $3.5 trillion that we are talking about in concept. Now let's put that concept down on paper and actually talk about the hard numbers for different things. So I think right now there's a golden opportunity to be able to advocate for that. And to your point, Andrea, there was actually a bill that we had a couple of years ago that had to do with climate change and with solar for rooftop folks. So Arizona tax court said that you could not tax people who were leasing versus buying outright the same amount. So that meant that people who were able to buy a solar panel program for their homes outright were paying a lower amount of taxes than they were if they leased it. So that meant the people who were already having to go on a finance plan because they probably couldn't afford to pay for it outright were now going to be hit with an even bigger tax bill. And I actually worked with my Republican colleagues a couple of years ago to change the law so that if people were leasing their solar panels, they weren't being held liable for a bigger tax hit for buying those panels through leasing versus just buying them outright, because it wasn't okay that people who could just afford to pay them outright were getting lower taxes on that solar panel installation. So we need to do more on that issue. And, I think that's a great idea, Andrea, that we're doing more to incentivize for people. And that's something that I've done at the legislature for the last couple of years, including also battery technology, because as things are getting better and we're able to store these things longer term, we need to make sure that we're making those investments in the battery technology. So I worked with one of the companies that was really looking at research and development to get research and development tax credits done to help create more incentives for us to do that research here in Arizona at our 3 state universities to help hopefully expand the ability for renewable energy to be stored and used long term.
Let's turn to Barbara Warren. Barbara, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Daniel. I want to ask you more specifically, do you feel that we are experiencing a climate emergency in this country, on this planet? And if so, what are all the things that you would advocate getting done if you're elected to this position? Irrelevant of what is already a bill in place, what are all the things that you would work to get done to address the climate emergency?
Thanks, Barbara. I think that's a wonderful question. So I think the first thing is we need to acknowledge how severe the crisis that we're currently in is. Being at the Arizona State Legislature, I hear from my colleagues on the Republican side that this is all just a hoax, that this is all being overblown by Democrats. And yet we are in the biggest drought that we've had in Arizona state history. The Colorado River is at really drastically low levels. There are farms and ranches in Pinal County where they're not allowed to grow anything anymore because of the high scarcity of water. So what we need to do is, one, acknowledge how bad the crisis is and start taking steps to meaningfully reduce and also to reuse. I've been to Israel a handful of times, and one of the things that I was always impressed by when I traveled to Israel was their high reutilization of water. They reuse their water about 85%, and Arizona's in the low 20s. We have very arid and dry climates here in the desert, and we need to do more to really create a change so that people are getting used to using reused water, not just for watering their grass, but also for everything, and purifying it and using that technology that already exists to maximize our water, to make sure that we are reducing water in the desert, to make sure that we are preserving our state as much as we can and any growth that we might have. We also need to look at doing more renewable energy, and that's why I've been a champion for creating tax credits and other incentives. At the legislature, we're really limited in what kind of incentives we're able to do for renewable and clean energy technology, but we need to do training to make sure that we take people who have been in jobs where traditionally they've been creating more pollution, particularly folks working at things like coal mines, retraining them and putting them back to work with good union jobs. And that's why I'm excited that the current bill has some of that money. But when I get there, I know this is not going to be a problem that's going to be solved with one bill alone. And we're going to have to keep taking a look at how we are incentivizing funding different things like battery technology, and also moving towards a more sustainable future with more renewables, particularly in Arizona. It's, I think, a tragedy that in Arizona we have over 300 days of sunshine, and yet Germany has a higher rate of solar panel usage than the state of Arizona, and they have significantly less sunshine than the city of Tucson. So we need to do a lot more to incentivize that. We also need to be looking at how we're really changing the way that we use our roads. And I think there's a lot of things that can be done to really make sure that we're moving to more electric vehicles as well, and keeping up some of those subsidies to incentivize people moving away from carbon emitting to carbon neutral.
Let me call on Michael Bryan. Michael.
Hi, Daniel.
Hey, Michael.
I just wanted to get your take on something since you have a background in educational leadership. It seems that the Republicans are whipping up a lot of hysteria and fear in their base regarding two specific issues regarding children. One is the teaching of critical race theory, supposedly, in our schools, and the other is masking in the schools. I'd like to hear your take on how we combat that misinformation and fear campaign.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Michael. So I was on a school board for about 8 years, and I can tell you that there has been a very concerted effort on the right to recruit people to come to school board meetings and to eventually recruit people to run for these school boards. So we as Democrats need to make sure that we are not letting folks get a pass when they're running for these offices. We need to ask them hard questions, particularly on issues around safety. I think I was really disappointed to see that more school districts didn't join in on the effort to try and protect their students and staff by requiring masks. But this has been an effort for the right for a long time to not only get people elected to school boards, but to create a pipeline so they can run people for higher offices, city councils, legislatures, et cetera. So I think we need to do a better job of making sure that we are helping recruit folks. I used to do a job where all I did was talk to former teachers about running for different offices, including for school boards. So we need to have more advocates on these school boards. I think when we're talking about critical race theory, we had something that was very strange this year that happened. We passed a ban on critical race theory, but then we also passed a bill that would allow teachers to be held liable for a fine if they taught a controversial topic and they didn't teach both sides of an issue. But it still is in conflict with the law that we passed over on critical race theory. So I think what's happening is there is this big movement on the far right to really demonize our schools and to treat them as if they were these breeding grounds for awful things. There was a small moment in time where they were talking about requiring teachers to wear body cameras so that we could observe and monitor exactly what teachers were doing all day, every day. So I think, one, we need to tamp down on this attack against our teachers and this attempt to try and demonize our teachers as being anything other than the really, really big-hearted public servants that they are, because they do not get paid nearly enough to do amazing things, which is make sure that we're preparing the next generation. So I think, one, we need to combat these attacks head on, and we need to call them out for what they are, which is partisan attacks on teachers. They can mask it and say, oh, it's really about, not teaching controversial subjects like critical race theory. But the reality is this is just an attempt to politicize education and to politicize our teachers, and to keep using our teachers as punching bags, I think, is wrong. That's why I've been really supportive and outspoken against the attacks on our teachers for years. And that's why I'm proud to be endorsed by the Arizona Federation of Teachers. I think we also need to really be looking at, when we're talking about these controversial subjects, there are going to be some people who we are never going to get across to, but there are a lot of people who don't know enough about these topics that we can do a lot more to really make sure that we educate them on why it's important to teach things like the reasons why slavery wasn't good. Because there are times where we'll have folks that say, oh, critical race theory sounds really scary, or sex education sounds really scary. And then we break it down and explain, here's what we're talking about when we're talking about these topics. We've had, for the last couple of years, I think, the Republicans doing a better job of communicating and making things sound scary. But when we're talking about these topics, and when we're having educators at the forefront, who are the ones that are actually on the front lines talking about what they're teaching, I think we're able to show to the everyday person and the everyday voter who is not a Republican PC that this is not a scary thing, that this is actually an attempt to teach our kids to be more critical thinkers, to be able to understand where they come from in the history of this country, but to also challenge us to be better and to work harder to make sure that we're treating all people equally, and that we are creating equity in every place where it doesn't exist.
One of the important things facing Congress right now is the whole issue of voting rights, Daniel. What's your position on that, and how do you think we can protect voting rights from a national level?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question, Larry. So I've been working on the For the People Act, HR1 and S1 for months. I've been partnering with End Citizens United, and I actually was just in Washington, D.C. with about 10 other lawmakers that I brought a delegation to try and meet with Senators Kelly and Senator Sinema, who are both co-sponsors of the legislation. But we want to say, we are now in a completely different place than we were in February when it comes to voting rights. In Arizona, Texas, and in Georgia, we've seen that voting rights have come under attack by Republican-led legislatures because instead of trying to change voters' minds or trying to change the rules to make it easier for them to maintain power. And I think that's really concerning. We're seeing with this audit that happened in Maricopa County and is still ongoing, that these are problems that don't just go away in one day or two. They are pervasive. They are problems that we have to really address and tackle head on. So I think we need to make sure that we pass the HR 1, the For the People Act, and also HR 4, which is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. After the Supreme Court struck down several parts of the Voting Rights Act from the Civil Rights era, there have been things that have become really, really dangerous that have to do with things like redistricting that we need to really address soon. And that's why it's incumbent. That's why I've been working on this for months, including flying out to DC with about 10 other state lawmakers from Arizona and over 100 from around the country to talk to our, not just senators from Arizona, but from around the country on the urgency in passing these two laws. The For the People Act, for those of you that don't know, has a lot of democracy protections. It includes campaign finance reform to get dark money out of politics and to reduce the impact and the power of corporate PACs and also of special interest groups. There's also provisions that say how long people have the ability to be able to vote early and by mail, because we saw that during the pandemic, that was a really big issue that we needed to address. So there are a lot of things that are in those proposals that need to get done to make sure that we're protecting people's voting rights. And it also would make sure that state legislatures like the one here in Arizona or the ones in Georgia and in places like Texas are not undermining people's ability to register and to exercise their right to vote. So these are very, very important. I've worked really closely with partners like End Citizens United, and we're actually doing a town hall here in Tucson that I'll send the details out to Larry about in a couple of weeks on September 8th, where we're going to have folks talking about the impact on the For the People Act on the Latino community. And we're going to have LULAC and Senator Sally Ann Gonzalez and Representative Hernandez, my sister, talking about the importance of passing these vital protections for the Latino community, but for all of Arizona to ensure that we have better laws to protect our voting rights, because there's nothing more fundamental than that.
I couldn't agree more. We have a question from Steve Early. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Steve.
Hey, Steve.
Hi, Daniel. There's been a lot of controversy about statues and who they honor and who they don't honor. And I have a pet peeve because I live in Tucson and we have a statue of a murderer of American citizens on Congress. And if the other people are guilty of horrible things, I think raiding the United States and killing Americans and then going south and wiping out a village and raping all the women, that kind of makes it hard to be a good statue. So wouldn't Father Kino be a better man down there? and put Pancho Villa somewhere else?
Yeah, I think the issue of statues is one that's another manufactured kind of controversy on the right. When we are using statues, we're honoring people for good things that they've done. And yet we see all over the country that we have statues that are honoring people who have done seditious acts, people that have murdered American citizens. The fact that we have Civil War statues in Arizona and streets that are still named after Confederate Civil War icons, I think is problematic. And I think it's one of those things where we shouldn't be honoring those who didn't actually do things to make America a better place. So I do think that there are better folks that we could have statues of, including Father Kino. I think there's also a lot of really great people from Arizona, even more recently, folks like Sandra Day O'Connor, who I think would be a really great person to honor as the first woman U.S. Supreme Court justice. And there's no shortage of great Arizonans who have done a lot to contribute. Raul Castro is another one that comes to mind, the first Latino American governor here in Arizona, who was also the ambassador to several countries. So we have a lot of folks that I think we could and should be honoring instead of some of the other folks who've done things that I think we're not supporting the U.S. and making sure that we were making this country a better place.
Okay, we've got a question from Michael Bryan. Go right ahead.
What committees are you interested in serving on should you be elected to Congress, and why?
I don't want to be presumptuous and, and assume what committees. I think, particularly because of the region and because of the things that we have here in Arizona, and particularly in Southern Arizona, with Davis Monthan Air Force Base, with also the base at Fort Huachuca, I would be really interested in serving on the Armed Services Committee because it's something that's a big employer and is something that's very important. We have a large population of veterans. Veterans Affairs is another thing that I think is very important that we need to be doing more. Obviously, education and healthcare are some of my top priorities. So anything where I'm able to contribute on healthcare and on education are really, really important to me, particularly when we're looking at the issue of title funds. I think there's a lot of things that we need to be doing at the federal level to really re-examine how we're using and leveraging federal dollars to create more incentives so that states like Arizona actually are putting more money to where it's needed the most. And those are the kids that are struggling the most, because you don't give more money to the kids that are doing the best and have the best schools and have the most resources locally. You need to give more resources to the kids that have the least so that they can have that ability to achieve some level of equity. And I think we can use and leverage federal dollars to be able to try and maximize how much states are investing at the local level. I also am really excited about the possibility of doing things to be able to strengthen and expand the Affordable Care Act to make sure that we're providing access to folks. But one of the things that I see and hear all the time when I'm talking to folks in places like Cochise County is you shouldn't have to drive an hour or more to be able to see your doctor and to see specialists. So we need to do things like expanding the education programs and the loan repayment programs so we can get physicians and nurses and doctors to go and work in these rural communities, these low-income communities, and also these tribal communities, and create incentives for them to stay there. Because what we don't want to have to keep happening is this brain drain where they go down to a rural community, finish out their residency, and then are in a big city, and now that place is left without where they're not able to have the resources that they need.
Okay, we have a question in the chat from Barbara Warren. She would like to know if you will support and vote for the Medicare for All bill in Congress.
Yeah, like I was just mentioning, healthcare is a really important thing. It's something that I've been working on in the legislature for a long time. And we just had a really important bill this year because of the pandemic and people losing their jobs. We saw a lot of people who were actually needing to be put onto the Medicaid program here in Arizona, the Access program, as many of you know it. And I was proud to be one of the folks to be able to support that and to make sure that we expanded it and that we kept it so that people were being able to continue to have low or free healthcare. Healthcare is really tricky and really important for a lot of different people. I personally know how hard it is to not have health insurance. When I was 17 years old, when I first started getting involved in politics, I was diagnosed with something called Graves' disease, which is an autoimmune disorder. We didn't have health insurance at the time. My parents were really hardworking, but my dad had gotten injured and lost his job as a construction worker. And because he didn't have any work coming in, he couldn't pay for things, and we almost lost our home. But during that time, we were trying to apply for Kids Care, which is the state children's health insurance program. And because of paperwork issues, I didn't have health insurance for almost 8 months. And during those 8 months, my body started shutting down. My kidney, my liver, my heart were all struggling to be able to work. And we weren't able to get the health care that I needed. Eventually, I was able to get on the state children's health insurance program and within a couple of months be able to get back to health. But I saw firsthand on the brink of death how hard it is to not have health insurance. So that's why I'm really focused on let's make sure that we're expanding the Affordable Care Act and doing everything that we can to protect those who have pre-existing conditions like myself and like so many other Americans, making sure we're doing everything that we can to increase those subsidies. Because I think one of the big things that we're seeing is there are people who are working, but they make too much money to qualify for the low-income healthcare programs, and the exchange is just too expensive for them. So there are people who are falling into this middle hole where they make too much money to qualify for subsidies, but not enough money to pay for their health insurance on their own. So they're choosing to go without it. And then when something happens, they end up having really poor healthcare outcomes. I'm also a big champion of making sure that we're fighting and expanding the federally qualified health centers, which are just fabulous. I represent Santa Cruz County right now, and we have one really big federally qualified health center in Nogales called the Mariposa Health Centers. We have the El Rio clinics in Tucson, and these are all health centers that do amazing work to make sure that we're keeping people out of our hospitals and treating chronic conditions with primary care doctors, which in the long term is better for everyone. You get better health outcomes, and you also get lower cost health options when you're not having to show up to the hospital for something that you could have seen your regular doctor for.
So what you're describing is a fragmented mess where people struggle. We struggle to cover patchwork, this population, that population. I agree that community health centers are wonderful. I agree with a lot of the programs we built to try to fill in the gaps. Medicare for all would cover all of that, everybody in this country. My question was, will you support the bill that is in Congress that Congressman Grijalva has signed on to, Medicare for all? Can you commit to that?
I'll have to take a look at it. I'm not too familiar with all the details, so I'll have to get back to you.
Thank you.
One question we haven't discussed yet, Daniel, is immigration reform. What can be done to create a pathway to citizenship for people that immigrate into this country, and particularly the DACA recipients?
Thanks for that question, Larry. So living in Southern Arizona and representing a border county for the last 5 years in the legislature, I know that far too often we see that our border is used as a photo op by generally Republican politicians every 2 to 4 years when it's time to run for re-election. So they can talk about how there is a crisis at the border and we need to do more. And they demonize these communities as being unsafe. Border communities are some of the safest communities in the country. But we need to do more to make sure that we're actually stop talking about how dangerous the border is and actually talk about the real problem, which is Republican politicians using immigration as this trope every 2 to 4 years to try and rally anti-immigrant hate against particularly the Latino community here in Arizona. We need to do something to bring people out of the shadows. And that's why I've been working on comprehensive immigration reform since 2010, back when Arizona passed SB 1070. I started working with different community groups to make sure that we were passing real comprehensive immigration reform to make sure that we were doing everything we could, not just for the children who are the dreamers, but for their families. Because I think we have had years and years and years of us talking about it and doing nothing on it, and we need to actually act. This is something that Republicans can agree to, independents can agree to, and Democrats can agree to, which is we need to bring people out of the shadows, and we need to create a plan for how we bring these people back into mainstream and from out of the shadows and into a pathway to citizenship. This plan that I think we have talked about in the past that was bipartisan, Chuck Schumer introduced a couple of years ago, is a good framework of where we can start, but we need to make sure that we're doing more to include voices of people that actually live on the U.S.-Mexico border. I was just talking to the mayor in Nogales about a lot of the challenges that they're having, and the challenges are not even about immigration. It's we cannot have people coming from Mexico right now to the U.S. to travel for tourism, and that is impacting the economy in Douglas, in Sierra Vista, in Nogales, and all along the U.S.-Mexico border, because the people that would come and eat at our restaurants, shop at our stores, buy their groceries here are no longer able to do that. And that is having a really detrimental impact on these really small border communities, many of which may not even be able to be around and may have to make massive cuts over the next couple of years if we don't fix that. So we need to do something to make sure that we are having border security, but more importantly, having a real conversation about how we make sure that we bring people out of the shadows, pass comprehensive immigration reform, and not stop just with the dreamers, because it's not enough to only take care of those young people. We need to take care of all of the folks who've been contributing and been a part of Arizona and other states around the country for a long time.
For our final question, let's turn again to Michael Bryan. Go ahead, Michael.
Daniel, a lot of people feel that the influence of money in our politics really, really bad and pernicious. What pledges have you taken or are you willing to take regarding the source of your funding, and what bills or legislative initiatives are you supporting in order to reform the role of money in our politics?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Michael. So like I mentioned a little while ago, I've been a big proponent on the For the People Act. I've been fighting really, really hard, holding community events on Zoom, talking to lawmakers here in Arizona, encouraging them to reach out. I've talked to Mark Robert Gordon, and I need to follow up with him now that I see you on the call about the importance of the For the People Act to make sure that we're not only looking at campaign finance reform, but just democracy protections overall. We've been working to try and push Senator Kelly and Senator Sinema, and thankfully they're co-sponsors of this legislation, but it's not enough to just have them be co-sponsors. We really need them to keep fighting and to make sure that they're champions so we can get this done. That's going to mean probably taking a look at having another attempt in the next couple of weeks when they come back in September from their August recess. So I think that's one of the big things that we need to do to make sure that we're reforming that system. We've tried at the state level, and I think what we really need is federal action to really change campaign finance reform and to take dark money out of politics. When it comes to my campaign, we have had over 1,500 individual donors. We're powered by people and cactus roots. So if folks would like to go, they can contribute. We've not taken any corporate donations from any PACs. The PACs that we've gotten money from include Equality PAC and the Victory Fund and the Boilermakers. So people are able to help out if they go to DanielHernandezForCongress.com. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to have the For the People Act get passed this year before I get to Congress, because I think we really need to take urgent action to change campaign finances, because every year we see more and more money being pumped into these elections, and it's really problematic and I think really concerning to see how much money is being spent, especially because we're going to have a really tough time in 2022 trying to make sure that we keep the majority in the House and also making sure that we protect Senator Kelly and Senator Raphael Warnock out of Georgia.
All right, Daniel, thank you so much. This has been a very enlightening program today. Express our gratitude for having you come. And to close out our meeting, would you tell us, how can people get a hold of you? How can we find out more about you and your positions? And what can people do to support your run for Congress?
So what I just did in the chat box is I sent my email. If you have any questions about the campaign or just wanted to send an idea, just go ahead and send it to that email. And that's also my website. On social media. You can follow me on Twitter, and I'll go ahead and put that Twitter handle as well, and then also the Facebook page.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We wish you all the best, and we'll see all of you in 2 weeks. Next week is Labor Day, and we're not meeting, so we'll see you 2 weeks from now. So long, everybody. It was great to see you today.